Welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma, and today I want to talk about the way that we speak to each other. So in Buddhist teachings, the third factor in the Eightfold Path is wise speech. And out of all the 8 path factors, there are 3 of them that come under the heading of ethics and values. And wise speech, or right speech as it's sometimes referred to, is the first of the ethics and values factors. And it also comes up elsewhere. The training precepts, the paramis, it's really seen as being very important. And sometimes it can be really quite challenging. It sounds easy, but it's not. Wise speech in Buddhist teachings is defined as abstaining from false speech, in other words, not lying, and also avoiding malicious speech and harsh speech and idle chatter. Now I want to be clear that this isn't about a set of commandments. It's about a practice, it's about a lifelong practice. So the teachings on wise speech are there to open up a sense of inquiry. In other words, we're working out what's helpful and what's unhelpful, and what causes agitation and stress and suffering, and what actually alleviates those things. Now recently I received an invitation to go to a do. It was an evening do. It was a charity fundraiser, some distance away from home. And it would have meant travelling down and staying in a hotel, and there was quite a lot of expense. And it would have meant sitting making conversation with people that I didn't know and shouting over the music. And to be honest, I really just didn't want to go. And I agonised over this for weeks. And I went between thinking I really should go and support them, and then not wanting to go, and then thinking, what are they going to think of me if I let them down? And maybe I can just pretend I've got a family birthday or something. I couldn't actually bring myself to make up a lie in this situation, so eventually I just told the truth. Said I wasn't coming, and of course it was absolutely fine. I got a really lovely understanding reply from the organiser who'd invited me. And it really amused me afterwards how much I'd fretted about this and complicated it. All I had to do was tell the truth. So our lack of honesty can often be about self-view. So we can be very preoccupied with how we appear to ourselves and to others. And this can end up with us just creating this false self. And it's a perfect, pleasing self that we try and put out there in the public domain. And of course it's all nonsense. It's all absolute nonsense. It can make us less truthful to ourselves and to others. And I read somewhere, according to research, and I always find this kind of thing a bit horrifying, lying makes up 7% of total communication. But the other bit that was interesting is that almost 90% of all lies that we tell are little white lies. And that includes things like false modesty and things that we say to avoid conflict or to avoid hurting someone's feelings. Things we say because we're scared of how people are going to see us. And I think, so maybe it's hard to be 100% honest in every interaction. But I see a commitment to communicating more honestly as being a training. So even if truthfulness can make us uncomfortable sometimes, it can bring a certain amount of dissonance up to the surface. But being able to face that dissonance, meeting it with honesty and investigating it maybe, that's where the growth happens. So wise speech as a practice really helps us to identify when we're getting tied up in self-view. And in that way, wise speech becomes a form of inquiry. And it can really help us to see the process of building a sense of self and maybe calm that process a bit. Now, the way I see it, being honest doesn't necessarily mean having to articulate every single thought that pops into your head. Not everything has to be said. And the practice of wise speech also involves abstaining from malicious and harsh speech. The Buddha once said something along the lines of, beware the dagger behind the teeth. And this sounds simple enough, but it can actually be quite difficult. We would all like to think that we're never harsh or never unkind. Most of us partake in some form of gossip. And actually, if you try going 24 hours without talking about other people, it's quite difficult. Criticizing others is bonding. And we can agree someone else is not like us. It can actually feed into the ego's need to feel superior. And also, of course, we have a deep need for connection. And that's a really wholesome desire. But like many of our desires, it can be expressed mindlessly, it can be expressed unskillfully. So our attachment to wrong speech feels completely natural until we start to examine it. And once we do start to look, we can set an intention. So, for example, a commitment to refrain from lying or backbiting or harsh speech really gives us something to work with. And it's something that was seen by the Buddha as being profoundly important. As I said, it's one of the 8 path factors, and it comes into a number of teachings. In the Metta Sutta, which is the most famous teaching on kindness and friendliness, encourages us to be straightforward and gentle in speech. Straightforward and gentle in speech. And in another sutta, the Buddha advises his son Rahula to reflect on his speech before, during, and after speaking, and to consider whether it leads to his own suffering, or to the suffering of others, or to both, and whether it's an unskillful verbal act with painful consequences or a skillful verbal action with happy consequences. So why is this so important? Why is speech so central in Buddhist teachings? It's important because the spiritual path is very much about our relationships with others. So it's about non-harming, but it's also about caring for other people, loving other people. It's also about living in harmony with the world. And the way that we speak to others is a big part of that. That's the kind of people that we are. We're linguistic, verbal beings. And becoming more conscious of what we say provides a window into our inner world. So what about the other type of speech that we're encouraged to avoid, which is idle chatter? I think this one isn't maybe so straightforward. So in his teachings to monastics, the Buddha was very clear. Don't waste your time on idle chat. And in the Anguttara Nikaya, he encourages his monastics to speak of what is factual, what's in accordance with the goal, the teachings, the monastic rules. And I know that some Buddhist monks in places like Thailand and Burma actually adhere to that. I don't think that's always necessarily realistic for us as householders. I think sometimes we have to talk about trivial stuff. Sometimes we chatter to connect with one another, and maybe even to put someone at their ease. And so, for example, my mum has dementia, so when I speak to her, I just chatter on about what's happening in my life. It's mostly all the trivial stuff. And if we didn't do that, we wouldn't have anything to talk about. And I think wise speech is really determined by the intention. You know, we could equally talk about intentional speech. Speaking mindfully, knowing the intention behind our words. Maybe expressing ourselves consciously, truthfully and kindly. And offering compassion and not harming people. And being present whenever we can. There's actually quite a lot that Buddhist teachings don't say about communication and relationships. Sometimes the suttas can be quite austere. And maybe we have to use some of our own discernment when we're thinking about what wise speech might mean for us. So I don't think we're actually trying to achieve perfect speech. I think there's even a danger in trying too hard. Trying to be good all the time doesn't necessarily lead to healthy relationships. And our growth and our learning needs some reality. They need some grit. They need some authenticity. We also need to be able to laugh sometimes. So instead, as I said at the start, we can look at right speech as a practice, as a training. And it's not about trying to adhere to a narrow set of rules. I think it's about considering whether what we're about to say is beneficial or harmful, and whether we're causing suffering or whether we're reducing suffering, and whether we're bringing people together or whether we're pushing them apart. As humans, we're completely dependent upon each other, and we sometimes forget that, but we are. And a lot of the time we feel separate, and we forget how we're part of the same system. We're all part of the same system, and just as wise speech reinforces our sense of interconnection, our sense of oneness, speech that's harsh, speech that's untruthful, reinforces our sense of separateness. So bringing intention to our speech actually makes it a vehicle for our awakening, and for growth and learning and finding our place in the world. As I said, this is a practice. All of our relationships are based on communication. And our intimate relationships, our closest relationships, are really a microcosm of the wider world. And the problems in the wider world are very much reflected in our day-to-day relationships. Problems of misunderstanding, of miscommunication, of building up resentment and so on. And these problems are manifold. The world is in a strange place at the moment. It feels quite dangerous in some ways. I think polarization is on the rise. And maybe we have a bigger responsibility than ever to spread calm, even in our own small way. Just embodying connection and compassion in our own immediate circles. And one way we can do this is by bringing conscious intention to our speech. And that includes practicing wise speech and restraint. Maybe whenever we feel fear or anger or irritation or separation. And the Buddha put it this way: speak with kindly motivation, speak what is true and helpful, speak in due season and to the benefit of all. So that's what I wanted to say this week, and thank you for listening. Hope you can join me again on another episode of Kitchen Sink Dharma.